Welcome to Section 2, Module 3. Today we're going to go over the necessity of equilibrium and why disequilibrium cannot last in an uncontrolled market. We're going to go over price floors, price ceilings, and quantity controls and their effects on price and quantity. So all markets tend to go to equilibrium. That's the second principle of economics. What we call equilibrium, it's the point where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, also known at the point where the supply curve intersects the demand curve. Equilibrium is a point that makes the market be efficient because no one else can be better off without making someone else worse off. Remember that the quantity a person is willing to demand or a market is willing to demand, it's set. And the quantity a market is willing to supply is also set, of course, both depending on a specific price. So right now, the point of equilibrium, where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, is going to be at point E. And that point is efficient because let's say we increase the price. If we increase the price, at this point there is going to be a surplus. Why? Because suppliers are going to be producing at this point, because that suppliers, remember, they have predetermined which quantity they're going to supply at a given price, and at that given price they're going to supply this quantity. Consumers, it happens this exact same way for them. At this price, they have decided that they're going to consume this much quantity. Also remember, the law of supply says that at higher prices, firms are going to supply more quantity, which here we can see an increase, and a higher price, the law of demand says that consumers are going to demand less quantity. So therefore, producers are going to be producing here, and consumers are going to be buying over here, and this is going to be a surplus. Because there is a surplus, firms are actually going to have to start selling their product at a lower price, because if they don't sell the product, then they're going to make no profit off of it. And then consumers, because there's too much of it, are actually going to start willing to pay less until the price goes down, and the producers also decrease the price to equilibrium. And at equilibrium, everyone who wants to buy the product and everyone who wants to sell the product is able to do so. Instead, at the point where we have a higher price, that's why we think the market is not efficient at any other price, in this case if the price is above equilibrium, because all these consumers over here that wanted to buy the price, they're not going to be able to do it anymore if the price goes up. And all these producers or firms are not going to be rewarded anymore by being able to produce a product at a lower price, because they'll have to sell it at this price anyway. But now say there is a price floor, which is that the government or a union establishes a minimum wage. Firms should pay their employees. A price floor can be on anything. A minimum wage is just an example, but a price floor happens whenever a centralized government says that there's a minimum price consumers should pay for a specific product. And through this example, I'm going to show you why unions demanding higher wages is actually not efficient at all, because it actually harms their workers. Let's say that the equilibrium price and quantity of this market is going to be 6.5 and Q star. Let's say that the union talks to the firms and they set a minimum wage of 7.25. At this place, firms are going to be willing to demand only this amount of workers. We already talked about why that's going to happen. And firms in this case are going to be the consumers. Remember, the product we're selling right here, it's labor. So firms are going to get labor, and people, employees, are going to supply labor. So firms are going to demand labor at this point, and you know, workers are going to be willing to supply this amount of labor, all this amount of labor, when the price is 7.25. And there's going to be a surplus, because firms demand this amount of labor, but workers are willing to supply all this amount of labor. So this over here is going to be workers that are going to be unemployed. So there's going to be unemployment, also called a surplus of labor. Most people get excited because there's a rise in minimum wage. Nevertheless, it is proven that mostly students are the only people that get paid at minimum wage. So let's say this is the minimum wage. It's 5.25. That point, the minimum wage is actually going to be below equilibrium price. So all this is saying is that, let's say the government establishes this minimum wage. All this is saying is that firms should pay at least their employees $5.25. Nevertheless, at equilibrium, they're paying their employees $6.5 anyway. So in this case, this price floor would be non-binding because it has no effect, as most minimum wages, in fact. Let's talk about some inefficiencies that arise from a price floor. We have, a low quantity being what makes the surplus happen, because just a few people are going to demand a product, and more people are going to be willing to supply it. And so there's going to be a surplus, and that by itself is a waste of resources because no one's going to get it. Because there's a price floor. So in this case, the prices cannot lower to get rid of the surplus. And in the case the government buys it, which sometimes it happens, it's also a waste of resources because the money the government uses to buy the surplus comes from taxpayers who could have gotten the product anyway by just having the government having eliminated the price floor. Also, it's going to take time for the government to know where to put those resources, and those are just wasted resources, such as time in that case. There is also an inefficient allocation of sales among sellers. We already talked about this because people who the firms that are willing to produce a certain product at a lower price should be rewarded, but in this case, even inefficient firms are going to be willing to sell their product. Also, at a high price, firms tend to provide a very high quality, but that's also going to be inefficient because all these consumers don't care about the quality of the product. They just want to get the product. And the last one is illegal activity. So all these consumers that are not getting the product, they are likely to get it through the black market. Now, there's a positive thing from a price floor, or at least that's what the government thinks, or the unions think, that it's just to protect producers. Unions just want to protect their employees by setting a higher wage, a price floor. Nevertheless, that's just going to hurt them more because there's going to be unemployment for them, which wouldn't have happened at equilibrium at E, because everyone who's willing to provide labor at that price is willing to do so. So wonder why people go into the black market to get a job there? Well, economics gives the answer, and it's simply a result from a price floor, which is illegal activity. Now, for the same circumstances, when there is a price ceiling, so a maximum price consumers would have to pay to get a product, let's take for an example PL. At this price ceiling, consumers are going to be demanding more product than that suppliers are going to be supplying. So there is going to be a shortage. Because there's going to be a shortage, the consumers are going to start willing to pay higher prices, and producers are also going to start charging higher prices so they can optimize profit in order to get all this, in order to sell all this product they could be selling, and consequently prices are going to go up until they reach point E, which is equilibrium. Now let's take a look at what happens when the price ceiling is binding. So let's say the government says that at New York, the firms supplying apartments are only going to be able to charge up to $600. At that point, consumers are going to be demanding all these rooms or apartments, and firms are only going to be supplying this amount of apartments. And as a result, there is going to be a shortage of apartments. In this case, even though the government wanted to protect consumers so that they paid less for a product, it's going to hurt them because people who want to get an apartment are not going to be able to do so because firms are not providing those apartments. There's also there are going to be wasted resources because a shortage means that the consumers are going to have to be looking for rooms for apartments for a longer time, so they're going to waste time doing that. There's going to be an inefficient low quality because since there's a lot of demand for the firm's product, the firms can afford not to give decent apartments to the consumers. And also there can possibly be black market so that the consumers can get the product, for example, by offering firms a higher price for the apartment without the government knowing about it. The price ceiling, however, it is supposed to protect consumers so that they pay a lower price for a certain product. But as we see, the government doesn't really influence the willingness of supplier firms. So by selling a maximum product, if it's binding, if it's below equilibrium, they're just hurting the consumers. In the case they say that maximum price consumers have to pay, which is above equilibrium, then there will be no effect because consumers are going to pay for that product lower price anyway. Lastly, let's take a look at the quantity control, which in my opinion, it's one that sometimes should definitely be imposed. So in this market, which is the market for taxi rides, let's say there is a quota at 8 million. In that case, firms are going to be supplying this amount of taxi rides at $4, and consumers are going to be willing to they're going to demand 8 million taxi rides, but at $6. So as you can see, there's going to be a difference between the price the consumers are going to be willing to pay and the price firms are going to be at which they're going to be willing to supply the same amount of taxi rides. So that allows for a tax wedge, which is usually just a tax that goes to the government for giving a certain taxi drivers a license to drive the taxis. However, there is going to be an efficiency loss, also known as a deadweight loss, which is due to the transactions that could have occurred but that did not occur. In this case, the deadweight loss would be represented by this triangle because all these consumers would have liked to get the taxi rides, and all these firms would have liked to supply the taxi rides, but they can't because there's a quantity control, and that's why we have the deadweight loss. Don't worry about how to calculate the deadweight loss. We are going to learn how to do it later. Just have in mind that this is the deadweight loss. That's why we say that equilibrium is efficient, because everyone who wants to get a taxi ride can get a taxi ride, and everyone who's willing to supply a taxi ride it's going to supply a taxi ride at the equilibrium price. Alright, this is it, guys. I hope it was helpful, and it will definitely be when we get to section 2 module 4 changes in equilibrium, and thanks for watching.